Hello, this is a continuation of my video on John Watson and American behaviorism. I ended the first part of this video by describing John Watson's work to establish the human infant's unconditioned reflexes and emotional responses. Having established these basics, Watson's main aim was to show that virtually all other human behaviors and emotional reactions were built up of conditioned reflexes. Of particular interest was his little Albert experiment, to verify the hypothesis that most emotional responses were the result of conditioning. Watson and Rosalie Rayner, one of his students, conducted what soon became one of the most famous, or infamous, experiments in psychology. Carried out over the winter of 1919-1920, they sought to produce a conditioned fear response in an 11-month-old boy named Albert B. in the research. This started when Albert was 9 months old. Initially, Albert showed no fear when a white rat was placed near him, but he was fearful when a steel bar was banged with a hammer just behind his head. 2 months later, when these initial experiences had faded, Watson and Rayner began their experiment. A rat was placed just in front of the boy, and as he reached for it, the steel bar was struck hard. Albert responded by jumping violently, falling forward and burying his face in the mattress. The procedure was repeated, Albert again jumping and falling forward, but now also whimpering. Watson and Rayner then delayed further trials for a week, so as they said not to disturb the child too seriously, but a further half-dozen more pairings gave Albert a conditioned fear of the rat, so that even without the bar being banged, he would cry as soon as he saw the rat crawling away rapidly. Further observations showed that Albert had generalized his fear to other furry things, including a rabbit, a dog, a seal coat, cotton wool, and even Watson in a Santa Claus mask. Watson and Rayner noted with interest that even after a month without their intervention, Albert was still afraid of rats and other furry objects. The conditioning had been successful and seemingly permanent. This experiment would now be regarded as unethical, but it wasn't at the time, and no attempt was made whatsoever to decondition the boy from his fear, though Watson and Rayner did outline what they might have tried if they had had the opportunity. The Little Albert experiment marked a major turning point in Watson's involvement with psychology, events in his personal life coming to have a major impact on his professional status and activities. Watson had conducted the Albert experiments with Rosalie Rayner, for whom he developed a powerful passion. The couple began an affair, which soon became public knowledge, and led to an acrimonious and well-publicized divorce between Watson and his wife. As a consequence, Watson was forced to resign his academic position in September 1920. Just when he had reached the heights of his profession and the movement he was spearheading was succeeding, he was banished from the academic world. He was still only 42 years old. Watson now began a second and very well-paying career as a psychological advisor to a major advertising firm in New York. Combining his knowledge of psychology and emotional conditioning with his gift for salesmanship, he was able to conceive of some of the company's most successful campaigns, including getting the queens of Spain and Romania to give testimonials for Pond's cold cream and vanishing cream, another for Johnson & Johnson, convincing mothers to use baby powder after every nappy change, and a third for Maxwell House that helped to make the coffee break an American institution in offices, factories, and homes. During the 1920s, he also continued to have an indirect impact on behaviorist thought. He didn't do any original research, but he continued to write books and magazine articles about behaviorism and child-rearing. So, for example, he advocated strict behaviorist methods in which all emotionality and affection in relationships to children were banned. Some of Watson's former colleagues also adopted his newly presented ideas and incorporated them into behaviorist thinking. Himself now writing for a general audience rather than for academics, Watson was able to popularize his message, sometimes waxing messianically that it would be possible to create a better world through conditioning infants. Thus, in his 1924 book, Behaviorism, he opined that if he was given a healthy infant, then he could turn the child into any kind of specialist that was needed by society. This approach was later parodied by Aldous Huxley in his dystopian novel Brave New World in 1932, in which babies were put off teddy bears and books by aversion therapy. But Huxley accepted, many liberals and egalitarians welcomed Watson's message, as it provided a simple, convenient rebuttal to the hereditarian views of Galton's followers. Meanwhile, Watson had married Rosalie, and had 2 sons with her. In contrast to his first marriage, he was utterly devoted to his new wife, and in the 1930s enjoyed a comfortable life on their estate with her. Tragically, Rosalie contracted dysentery and died in 1935, whilst only in her mid-30s. Watson was then 58, and was completely shattered by his loss. Unable to express his feelings, he never spoke of Rosalie to their 2 sons. Later he became a near recluse, who no longer wrote, and who took little care of himself. In 1957, however, when Watson was nearly 80, he was surprised to be told that the American Psychological Association wanted to give him their gold medal for his contributions to psychology. After 40 years of academic exile, he felt unable to go on stage to accept the award in person, so one of his sons received it in his stead. The citation honored him as having initiated a revolution in psychological thought, which had been one of the vital determinants of modern psychology, and had led to much fruitful research. He died in the following year. Although Watson himself had fallen from favour and been effectively exiled from the academic world, the behaviourist paradigm he had created and promoted lived on, quickly becoming the dominant perspective, the ruling paradigm, in American psychology, as well as an important one in Europe, retaining that dominance for over 4 decades, from the 1920s through to the early 1960s, and being the American model of psychology that it exported to the rest of the world. Watson's role had been unique, giving behaviorism a vitality and power which it might otherwise have lacked. But it is arguable that its viewpoints might well have come to dominate American psychology even without him. Certainly it survived well enough in his absence. Let us now turn to the question of why behaviorism was so popular. Hunt argues that the main factor in behaviorism's success was its claim to be the first truly scientific psychology. 2.5 millennia of psychological speculation had already begun to yield to more objective methods with Wundt's New Psychology in the late 19th century, but the results had been meagre, and psychological thinkers still largely relied on unverifiable introspection. By contrast, behaviorism offered what was seen as a genuinely scientific psychology, constructed entirely from visible, measurable events based on causally connected stimulus-response units. Such units were presented as the basis for all animal and human behavior, and understanding them would lead to a psychology based on reactions as specific and unvarying as those of chemistry or physics. This would enable psychologists to predict the response to a given stimulus and state what the stimulus was that had led to a particular response. A second appealing factor was that behaviorism meant that psychologists could disregard all the intractable questions about mind, which philosophers had been laboring with for the past 24 centuries. Behaviorism said that we didn't need to know what was going on in the mind in order to explain behavior. The mind was like a black box. As long as we knew how it responded to certain stimuli, we didn't need to know how its internal workings worked. As part of this disregard, behaviorism rejected all talk about mental processes as belief in some bodiless entity that ran the brain's machinery, thus avoiding the mind-body problem, what Sir Gilbert Ryle later termed the ghost in the machine, an essentially soul-like entity implicit in all forms of psychological dualism. For Hunt, other contributory factors which made behaviorism appealing occurred in the context of American society and culture. Thus, behaviorism was practical, it sought common-sense knowledge that could be put to use, not ultimate explanations. Again, American urbanization, industrialization, and we should add immigration, had created a society of incomprehensible and worrisome strangers, and behaviorism seemed to offer a means of ordering this reality. The First World War had also evoked hostility to German psychology, and behaviorism offered an up-to-date and indigenous American replacement. Again, behaviorism fitted in well with the endemic anti-intellectualism of American culture. It justified ignorance of the subtleties of mentalist psychology, as these were deemed illusory or at best unknowable. There was also social pressure. There always was a minority of American psychologists who were concerned with mental processes, Freudians, Gestaltists, child development psychologists, and the like. But on most campuses, these people had to adopt their work and language to the prevailing behaviorist paradigm. One psychologist going so far as to say that it would have cost him his career to publish on subjects like mind and volition. Mentalist psychologists were seen as people who believed in outdated, subjective, mystical concepts. Watson's importance in the development of American psychology had finally been acknowledged by the American Psychological Association's gold medal in 1957, and he may well have died still believing that the revolution he had started would be the future of psychology. It wasn't. There is now almost complete rejection of some aspects of his work. Almost no one today holds such an extreme environmentalist view on behavior as he did. Nor do child experts now recommend withholding affection from children and rearing them according to rigid behaviorist rules. Indeed, long before the cognitive revolution, so-called, overtook American psychology in the 1960s, the limitations of Watsonite behaviorism had become evident, even to those who continued to see themselves as behaviorist, a major factor in the emergence of the neo-behaviorism, which I will examine in the next few videos in this series. One aspect of this shift was the evident superficiality of much of behaviorist research, even in the movement's heyday. Thus, Hunt gives the following examples of what he sees as typical published research from this period, both of these from 1935. The influence of hunger on the pecking responses of chickens, and the galvanic skin reflex as related to overt emotional expression. These were no doubt objective scientific contributions to human knowledge, but they can't be described as profound or very enlightening topics. Again, simple Watsonian behaviorism was increasingly found to be inadequate as an explanation for complex and sophisticated behavior. Watson's account had oversimplified and overstated many issues, and later behaviorists had to elaborate and quantify them. Thus, the development of neo-behaviorism and such concepts as Skinner's operant conditioning, which I will discuss in the next 3 videos. Thank you.